was listening to this radio show a little while back, and it was really fascinating. It was kind of talking about sort of the separation between our bodies and what we think of as ourselves. And one of the interesting things it pointed out, of course, is that the cells that we have in our body are kind of replacing themselves, as we go through our lives. That the cells that we are made up who we are, of course, when we're born, aren't necessarily the same ones that are still there when we get to much older and towards the ends of our lives. And I think this is kind of intuitive, right? Because if we think about it, when we have children, right, when we see like little babies, like cute little babies, oh, coochie coo, right? Like they're little tiny things, right? And then you like give them food and they grow up into like kids. And kids are kind of cute, right? They can be a little annoying at times, but kids are okay. And then they become teenagers, and they're kind of annoying, super. And then they become people. I mean, hopefully that's the trajectory they're on anyway, right? But I mean, clearly, when you start out with a little baby, and like 20 years later, you end up with like a fairly decent human being. There's obviously been growth there. Right? Like that little 8-pound thing turns into like the 6-foot, 175-pound thing, right? And so they clearly have been adding, right? So as they eat, that food is turned into not just energy, but the material for them to sort of grow. But once we reach, 20, we continue to kind of change and evolve. And I think most of us can recognize that the bodies we have now are not exactly like the ones we had at 18. Unless you're like 20, and then it probably looks just about the same. But for most of us, there's been kind of an evolution, shall we say. But that doesn't change as we go through all of that, right? From the time we're little kids until we're in our dotage, we, I think, fundamentally feel like the same person. I mean, sure, we change, we adjust, we grow, we mature, hopefully. We learn our lessons, right? But we stay essentially the same. Because I remember my grandmother talking to me. She was probably about 90 or so at this point. It wasn't too long before she died. And she was talking about, for her, she didn't really feel like a different person than she did when she was 18, right? And so it was always kind of a surprise to like look in the mirror or to find that she couldn't do something that she used to do without thinking, right? Like I used to be like, just run around and I can't really do that anymore. Like, no, Grandma, definitely don't do that. And I think as I was pretty young when she told me this, and as I've gotten older, I have come to see the truth in what she said, that I don't feel any really different than I did as a person, right? I'm still the same me that was me 40 years ago, but I am starting to run into some noticeable effects of having been around for 40 additional years, right? I don't move quite as fast. I don't recover quite as quick. I have pains in places that I didn't actually aware were a part of my body. But they have announced themselves loud and clear, right? And so we grow and we change. And I think it was just really fascinating that our cells, the individual pieces that make up a person, the body, like the physical self, they change and they grow and they die and they get passed on and new ones come along. And even though physically, I am a completely different person than I was when I was born or even 40 years ago. I'm still fundamentally me, right? That even if the cells in my brain change themselves out, they hold on to the essence of who I am. And I think that that's really fascinating, that who we are sort of transcends, in some sense, our physical selves, right? And the way that we are particularly manifested in the world at this moment is different than it used to be, but it's still us. And I think this is, hopefully you've already figured this out, this is a great metaphor, I think, for the church, right? Because the church, its constituent parts change and get replaced, and new ones come along and old ones go away, and yet it still fundamentally remains. Right? And if we think about it, right, we read the New Testament, all those letters to the apostles, and they're writing to the various church communities like ours, except they're in places called like Ephesus and Thessalonica and Colossia and Galatia, They're in different places than where we are, but the troubles of these churches, the joys of these churches, the things they celebrated, the things they mourned, they continue to shape our lives as followers of Jesus. That the words that the apostles wrote thousands of years ago to those little communities still have an impact on how we live our lives, on the faith that we show into the world. And yet, for the most part, in fact, I'm pretty 100% sure 100% sure that none of those communities in the New Testament are still around. In fact, some of those cities no longer even exist. There's no more Ephesus. You're not going to find that on a map. Earthquakes ruined it 1,000 years ago. Colossia is gone. Galatia has a completely different name. That the people who live there have changed and altered, and the cities have disappeared, and the communities have risen and fallen. And yet still their words remain. Their impact on us remains. And when we look at our life in this community, right, and we can probably look around, well, I can't really, but some of you who've been here for a long time can look around and remember faces that you used to see that we don't see anymore. And some of those faces are probably up here on our high altar today with us. And that's why I love this day, this celebration of All Saints and All Souls that we have each year. Because it reminds us and calls our attention to the work of those people. Those people who moved through our lives and had an impact and contributed to this community and maybe were people who could listen to us or would give us good guidance or maybe they were just examples of people not to be. But they were here and they had a purpose and they were a part of this community and they've gone on and yet the community remains. Right, and if we look around, there are names on like the font, and there's a name on the giant brass eagle, and of course there's the names on the windows and on the various plaques. The soldiers lost to the First World War on the big plaque in the back, and they too were a part of this place, this community. And I know many of you bring memories of other communities of which you were a part that came and joined and formed a kind of a new community, and the continuation of that work also is sort of brought together here so that all of that work continues, that the church remains. Its shape changes, the people in it change, but the church remains. The love of God, which is what the church is. The church is a sacrament, right? In a sacrament, we think of the visible sign of an invisible grace. And the church is a sacrament of God because it's the visible manifestation of God's love. That's what we are. That's what we're here for. And our love doesn't require that we be a particular way. The way the church has gone about loving the world and bringing the grace of God into the world has changed. The liturgies change. The songs change. The buildings change. Styles change. Priests wear different clothes. Actually, priests never wear different clothes. We've worn the same clothes for 1,000 years. In fact, some of the vestments we have here, I'm pretty sure, are 1,000 years old. That's because they're so pretty. Anyway, that idea that we come and we go, and hopefully, eventually, all of us are a remembered and treasured person who's no longer seen but still felt. And our picture will join those on the high altar. And other people will be here, and they'll be continuing our mission and our ministry and far, far into the future. Right? That's our hope. And this community that stretches back across time that we call the church is something kind of unique in the world, because if we think about Jesus, right, on the day that Jesus was crucified, if there were probably 120 Christians. Well, they didn't call themselves that yet. 120 people who thought Jesus was something special. Now, we know about like the disciples, and the Gospels tell us of the women who were an important part of the community. In fact, such an important part of the community that Jesus chose to reveal his resurrected self to them first, before the people we think of as the disciples. But all of them together with this little tight-knit community. But before there was even that community, there was just Jesus. And he went to each one of those people and invited them into a relationship. And just as importantly, not just into a relationship with Jesus, but into a relationship with one another. And if we think about the day that Jesus died on the cross, and we think about that tiny little group and how dispirited they must have been, right? We read the stories of how they locked themselves in the room afraid to go out, about how they dejectedly just get out of town as fast as they can go until they encounter the resurrected Christ. And those disciples who never really understood what the heck Jesus was up to, suddenly it all began to make sense. But the most important thing that those disciples did in the resurrection of Jesus, the most important thing they did, even when they were terrified, was that they stuck together. They remained a community. That's what the church is. It's those people who stick together when they're afraid, when they're joyous, when things are good, when things are bad. They are people who are there for one another. And that's who we are at our very best, that we're people who can be there for one another. And that's what we remember on this All Saints Day, because if we think about Jesus, who went to each person one at a time and entered into a relationship with them and invited them into a relationship with him and with others, that work has been going on since the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And that each of us in turn was talked to by someone about Jesus. Maybe it was your parents who told you the story, or at least made you come to Sunday school and learn the story there. Maybe it was a friend. Maybe it was someone you knew at work. Maybe you just felt the call of the Spirit and you walked through the door and you just felt like this was a place where I'm welcomed and belong. But that work of bringing people into relationship with one another is what we are all about. That is the church's mission. And it's all of the things that we do, whether it's when we come in for the people on the altar guild and who do that lovely reverent ministry where they take care, if it's someone who comes in and cleans the bathrooms, or the people who bring in coffee hour, or when we have the potluck dinners and all of that across time. That's the real core of the church, is that building of relationship. And all of the ministries that we do, all the things we do where we take Christ's love and we want to take it out in the world, are fundamentally about connecting with other people, about sharing the love of God with them, sometimes with words, sometimes with soup. But on this day, on this celebration of all those who have gone before, the faithful departed who are no longer with us, we remember especially the contributions that they made, about the love that they brought into the world, and most especially about the love that they offered that brought us here to this place on this day together, to celebrate the love of God and to partake in this story that's moving across time until the end of the age, when Christ brings about a new kingdom where heaven and earth are combined, and we live in glory and are reunited with all of those that we see no longer in this world. That this day we remember that we are part of a chain of relationship that began with Jesus and will end with everybody. Amen.